There's growing national debate about the economic and social prospects of men and whether the struggles that some of them face signal something deeper about purpose, connection, and opportunity in American society today. New survey data uncovers surprising findings about how men are actually doing throughout the country.
This is not to say that men en masse are declining altogether, but there is a subpopulation of men who are seriously struggling and, in need of intervention.
On this episode, I'm joined by Beth Akers to help unpack new findings from a Sutherland Institute and Y2 Analytics survey that shed light on the missing anchors in men's lives that impact their health, vocation, and purpose. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. This year, Sutherland Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary, thanks to all those who support the work we do for Utah and our great nation. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're diving back into the issue of the well-being of men and boys. And to have this conversation, I'm pleased to welcome back in the studio Beth Akers, Senior Fellow for AEI and a contributor here at Defending Ideas. Beth, welcome back.
Hi, Nick. So glad to be back again.
Excited to have you back because we've been doing a lot of these conversations over the past year on the well-being of men and boys from a few different angles. Mm-hmm. And today we're actually going to be talking about a new report from Sutherland Institute that highlights some survey data of Utah men and U.S. men across the nation. And I kind of want to see if we can tie it all together and sort of finish off the year, if you will, with some takeaways for our audience that can inform how we address these issues starting in 2026.
Yeah, and it's so important too. We've talked to a lot of different experts throughout this series to try to understand what are the trends that men and boys are experiencing. A lot of it's national, but also I think in Utah we tend to feel like we're unique in a lot of ways, and I think that's especially relevant to this issue. So it's super important and interesting to hear about the findings of this and see how this issue is really facing men and boys here locally in Utah.
Absolutely. So we're going to include the link to the report in our show notes. Brand new report, again, from Sutherland Institute. We partnered with Y2 Analytics to survey, again, a Utah cohort and a national cohort of men. The report is called Missing Anchors, How Some Men Drift from Health, Vocation, and Purpose. And I want to start by we included a quote in the report that is from Stoic literature, from Seneca. So for folks who are deeply into that, probably know where this quote comes from. But I thought it was really apt for this, and it's, "If a man knows not which port he sails, no wind is favorable." So kind of this idea of men who are kind of not anchored to aspects of a flourishing life, whether it's work or family or faith communities. And the survey data reveals kind of what that looks like for Utah and national men. And obviously this is on the heels of the national conversations that are happening all across the country in recent years. We've had our friend Richard Reeves on the show, and of course his work with his book of Boys and Men and the American Institute for Boys and Men have helped to elevate this nationally.
Right.
We've also seen other policymakers around the country kind of diving into this. So it seems timely to really do a check-in with men across the country of, well, how are you doing? And this survey data, I think, will help elucidate some of that.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing this conversation elucidates is that your leisure reading is a lot more boring than mine is, Nick, because I'm not reading Stoic literature very often. But I do think this is an apt quote for describing this moment we're in. And, very clearly this has been a shift. I mean, 10 years ago, there were some conservatives talking about this issue. They had noticed the trends facing boys and men. But, as we'll talk a little bit more about, there has been just a really dramatic shift in our permission in society to talk about this issue. So we recognize that these patterns are there, but I think a lot of our hesitance to embrace and talk about solutions to these problems is that, men are fine, right? Men have had all these advantages throughout history, but that is true. And yet men are struggling in new ways, in ways that need our attention in different ways than the issues facing women and girls. And so there is this new environment, I think, thanks in large part to Richard Reeves, who's largely recognized as being, supportive of democratic policies, largely as saying, this is a real problem. And so you've got people coming to the center to talk about this issue, which is just remarkable and wonderful for this moment.
I agree. And by the way, the report does quote a rap country song.
Okay.
So I'll just tease that to the audience. So there's more popular stuff in there as well.
Okay, we need that balance, Nick. I'm glad that you have that balance within you too.
So again, I won't give it away. Go read the first part of the report. But Beth, I do want to read what kind of a segment from the beginning of the report to just set the stage. So this kind of gives the high level themes, and then start talking about how this ties into some of the conversations we've been having.
Yeah.
So here's kind of a key takeaway from the report. Again, Missing Acres, a new report from Sutherland Institute in partnership with Y2 Analytics. It says, we found that most men in Utah and throughout the nation report general satisfaction with their health, work, family life, faith connection, and sense of meaning. Broadly speaking, work, family, faith, and community connection are often protective influences that contribute to men's internal sense of purpose and fulfillment. In other words, these civic institutions can serve as positive anchors that help men lead thriving lives. And for most men in Utah and throughout the United States, that holds true. However, a significant portion of men struggle across these domains, all too often in ways that go unnoticed and unaddressed. This silent, struggling subset of men ranges from 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 of men across the nation reporting poor marks when it comes to mental health issues, vocational prospects, or their sense of purpose. So Beth, that kind of sets the stage, and kind of to your point of if folks say, well, what are men complaining about? There's all this discussion about historical trends and what men have experienced. And I think what this survey data shows is that, again, most men, most of the time, are doing okay.
Yeah.
But it's this subset that's really struggling in these areas that we really want to dive into that seems relevant to what we've been talking about this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so fun to see this issue bubbling up into, social conversations that I encounter in my life. I mean, this was an idea that was, deep in the conservative think tank culture for many years, and now is at, parties. But something I've noticed in a social group that I'm part of through my church community is there was a real concern about whether or not this is something that's okay to talk about. Like men are fine. They've added these advantages. And absolutely, I think it's helpful to point out, what this data highlights, which is that, yes, in mass, men are doing well enough, but there is a segment of the male U.S. population, men and boys, that are struggling in very serious ways. And the national data showed that. I mean, the deaths of despair, the increase in suicide rates among men, this is consistent with that. This is not to say that men en masse are declining altogether, but there is a subpopulation of men who are seriously struggling and, in need of intervention.
And one maybe editorial comment that comes to mind as well, because these and this was actually a theme throughout our podcast discussions over the last year or so, that there's, as you articulated, kind of this sensitivity, like, is it okay to talk about this? And Richard Reeves addresses this. Well, what about the conversations of the work, people addressing opportunities for women and girls in modern society? And I think part of that sensitivity is a function of the fact that our modern political culture has become so sort of anchored to this idea that it's sort of groups versus groups.
Yeah.
That this sort of equity mindset of, well, we have to make sure that the various groups are doing better or worse, kind of depending on their marginalization in the past. And that's where I think we just need to jettison all of that and recognize that for all Americans, there are things that folks might struggle with that we can intervene. There are things where folks might be doing well, and sort of get rid of if we talk about this group over here, does that mean we can't talk about this group? Like, I keep centering back to, this is not about pitting demographic groups against one another.
Right.
It's just about acknowledging where are people struggling and how can society help make a difference. So I think there's a little bit of a reframe.
I was talking to my 7-year-old this morning about what we were planning to do today with this conversation, and I sometimes think it can be helpful to boil things down in the way that you explain them to children. And I was saying, we were going to have this conversation about, ways that we can think about helping boys and men. And I said to him, I'm part of this group that thinks about these things, and there are other people who are parts of other groups that think about how to help girls and women. And I said, they're different because boys and girls are different. And That's true. I mean, we've had to, for a long time, I think there was a hesitance to even acknowledge that fact. But, it's true that we can devote some resources to supporting the challenges facing men and boys, and also a lot of resources to the problems facing girls and women. And those are distinct problems. I mean, that's the reality. And so absolutely, it's like we can walk and chew gum at the same time. This is not a zero-sum issue. We have the resources to support both communities. And, our society needs both communities to be thriving.
That's something actually that was mentioned in some of the Deseret News coverage of this, that we're involved with a task force on the well-being of men and boys. We work well with folks at the state, our governor's office, our Office of Families, but just kind of that idea that when you boil all this down, if you want Utah to be thriving, you need really healthy, engaged men and women.
That's right.
Essentially, we need everyone at the table. And to your point, if some of the challenges might be different or distinct, that's okay.
That's right.
But just the goal of we want everyone to be thriving and flourishing. And later in this episode, we'll get to some of the data points that answer that question of, well, what is the rate of thriving or flourishing for men in this case?
Yeah.
So I think that, what's the economics term, right? A rising tide lifts all.
That's right.
All ships,
all boats. Yeah.
All boats. That's kind of the idea with this, I think.
That's right. Absolutely.
Well, let's take a quick break because when I come back, I want to get into some of the details, in particular, some of the survey findings on mental health. And you mentioned the deaths of despair, the fact that 80% of suicides are men. And so I want to go through some of the mental health data and then maybe discuss how that fits in with these broader trends. And ultimately, we want to talk about how all of these things can inform our public conversations as a state and as a nation moving forward.
Sounds great.
So we're going to take a quick break. Again, this is Defending Ideas. We're talking with Beth Akers. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to jump back into our conversation with AEI's Beth Akers about the well-being of men and boys and some new survey data from Sutherland Institute on Y2 Analytics. But first, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today so far, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find access to this and previous episodes and clips. You can also subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to watch or listen to your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and click the subscribe button. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the little bell icon on your screen so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, all of that and more wherever you get your shows or at defendingideas.org. Beth, I want to kind of jump into the mental health side of the conversation because that's something that has really stood out to me as a really important piece of this. And maybe I want to ask, because we've had a number of these conversations on this show, on sort of the mental health, mental well-being side, what has stood out to you about that issue that maybe we don't talk enough about publicly?
Yeah. I think there's two things that have stood out to me that feel like worth grappling with further. First is this idea of a script for men. And this is something that Richard Reeves has been talking about, since he's first started this work. It's this idea of, as a man, who am I? What do I owe to my community, to myself, to the economy? Very clearly men have had a changing role over the past few generations. I mean, what men owe to their families is different as women's role in the workforce has evolved. And, again, that's not a bad thing that this change has happened, but there is a sense that this loss of a script has had an impact on men, and we need to deal with that fact. I think the other thing that has stood out is the idea of isolation and community and connectedness for men. There does seem to be a lacking, maybe even a growing lacking, when it comes to men's ability to feel connected and to not exist in isolation. And so when it comes to thinking about eventually the solutions here, I think that that's probably where we're going to end up going. But I'm really curious to see what does the data have to say about both of these things.
On the community aspect, it reminds me, as part of this survey research, the report that we're releasing now, we also conducted some focus group conversations with a handful of the respondents, just to find some anecdotal quotes and those kinds of things to accentuate data points. One of the comments in one of the focus group conversations was from a man who had been working fully remotely, and he made the comment that working fully remotely is great. I wouldn't trade it for the world. Like, I get all this extra time with my family, and that's a huge blessing. Then he said, but I'm also lonelier than I've ever been.
Yeah,
and I think it's because the report talks a lot about this theme of sort of missing anchors, right? The men who really struggle tend to not really be connected to a family, a faith community, their sort of civic infrastructure. If they are employed, they don't have a whole lot of satisfaction with their work situation.
Yeah.
But for the men who do have all those things, I think there's still sort of this dearth of community connection that if everything that I do is sort of my work and my family, and there's not other sort of, again, community or civic infrastructure beyond that, I think that can contribute to sort of the loneliness that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is another example of where, the trend of improved technology, the ability to work remotely, I mean, these are great things. We don't want to go backwards on that. In the same way that we don't want to go backwards on women's ability to participate in the workforce and be breadwinners for their family. These are great things, but it does demand that we change some other things to accommodate for the unintended consequences, I would call it, of these innovations. And so that's what we're facing.
And I think that, like, all of this stuff ties together. We tend to approach this issue, what we've been doing in these conversations with our task force and with this report, through the three buckets of health, vocation, and purpose. So mental and physical health. Vocation, we would say, work and education. And then purpose is kind of maybe the most nebulous, but I think in a lot of ways the most important. But they're all cross-cutting and related to one another. And I think some of the mental health data shows that. I want to share a couple of these stats from our report. So one, this goes to the argument or the notion, I guess, that, well, most men are still doing okay. So here's an example of that. Men nationwide report an average mental health score of 74.63. This is on a scale of 100, 100 being great, 0 being terrible.
And self-reported,
Yeah, self-reported. So nationally, men say their mental health on average is about 75. Utah men report an average of about 77, 78. So pretty comparable, like solid, decent, okay, however you would interpret that. But then when the survey asks about other things like stigma around mental health or social supports for those kinds of things, nationwide, 30% of men say they don't have anyone they can really talk to about their mental health. And then only 15% of Utah men say the same. So nationally, almost a third of men say, there's not really anyone I can talk to if I am experiencing mental health challenges.
Right.
15% in Utah. So we do better than the national average here in Utah. But still, nationally, almost a third of men saying, if I'm struggling with something, I can't talk to anyone about it. I don't have anyone. And that seems really striking to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also striking is the difference between the national reported level and locally, because this idea of connectedness, which seems really critical to the issue, is something I think Utah actually does really well on, in large part because religiosity is so high in Utah, and the structure of participation in a church community can create connectedness and these opportunities. And so it's interesting to see how that plays out in terms of men's sense of whether or not they have someone to talk to.
There's some survey findings in the report that looks at that specifically, that sort of asks religiosity, connection to a faith community, connection to family, how that impacts their self-reported answers to questions like, I understand my purpose in life, or I'm needed in society, or essentially, I know what I'm supposed to do. And it is higher for folks who report religiosity, for folks who report family connection. And so I think that I would interpret that as something that in Utah, because we have such high rates of married two-parent households, of religious engagement, of, again, these various layers of civic infrastructure.
Right.
I think sometimes people might hear that stat and say, well, if somebody says they don't have anyone to talk to about their mental health, we just need more mental health counselors.
Right.
That could be helpful in some ways.
Sure.
I don't actually think that's what this is saying. I think that's what you're saying. It's the community connection, sort of the social capital.
Yeah.
We have more of that in Utah, which I think partly explains that difference. that's maybe where we need to focus as a society. How do we build that up?
Yeah, and I'll say it happens to be religious-driven communities that we have here in Utah, but I honestly think that the critical piece when it comes to this is the community, and you could have institutions of all types that create community. It happens to be that religion does a really great job as an institution of creating community, but I think that's what we're seeing.
I agree. Another stat or two that really kind of stood out to me, this is really interesting, Beth, so I'd love to hear your perception on this, especially when, as a national expert in a number of ways and kind of looking at things from sort of the national perch, what this maybe tells you as far as this issue.
Okay.
So this is about kind of diving a little bit deeper into that question of, well, who can you talk to if you are struggling? Nationwide, 22% of men believe discussing mental health challenges with a professional is a sign of weakness.
Mm-hmm.
That perception actually increases to 29% when asked about discussing mental health challenges with someone in their immediate circle, like a spouse, partner, or close friend. So a little more than 1 in 5 say, I can't talk to a professional. That means that's weakness.
Yeah.
Closer to a third, 29%, saying if it's my wife, a close friend, someone in my circle, same kind of thing. So one, it's just the percentage to begin with, but the fact that there's a stigma that exists with talking to a mental health professional, but even a little bit more of a stigma when talking to someone in your immediate circle.
Right. That's so interesting. And how do Utah men compare on that?
So in Utah, it's 9% for both those categories. So in Utah, only 9% of men believe discussing mental health challenges with a professional or a spouse, partner, or friend is a sign of weakness. So that stigma is a lot lower in Utah than on the national level.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild. I mean, very, very clearly, like the sense of isolation that comes from not being able to speak to somebody about the things that you're grappling with internally, emotionally, is very serious. And the question that raises for me is, where do you go on that front? Because it's, I love these clean policy levers like tax credits and subsidies, and none of those speak to this particular challenge. So I know we'll get there in the conversation, but it just sort of begs the question for me is, what's the solution here?
I think that's spot on. We need to take a quick break here in a second, but when we come back, I want to dive in a little bit more on that topic because, to your point, we so often address any public policy issue or any societal issue as, to your point, well, what can the government do? What's the public policy intervention? And I think there are some on this topic for sure that we should be talking about. But I also think leaders, civic leaders, religious leaders, business leaders, and elected officials, governors and state legislators, and even folks at the federal level, yes, it's appropriate to think, well, let's stay in our lane when we're talking about government policy. But I think sometimes we undersell the power of the bully pulpit term that I think obviously is used typically to apply to the president or the governor or those kinds of things. But I think legislators have that too, that if more elected officials were talking more about, like, yes, what we do over here in government public policy is important and we can do some things that are helpful. We also need more of that social civic infrastructure. Yeah. And it kind of gets back to, I think you mentioned at the beginning, this idea of maybe self-responsibility as a society, that we as people, if we care about this issue, and anyone watching or listening to this, if you care about this and think, man, that we need to help improve these things, don't look to the government immediately. First, think, well, what can I do in my community, in my family, in my faith community, in my neighborhood? How do we leverage that civic infrastructure for social capital? I think that's something we can still talk about a lot more.
I think leadership matters, and I think this is an issue where leadership is going to matter really deeply in getting us out of the trajectory that we're on.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, there's some really interesting findings on questions of purpose, on questions of masculinity, and what that looks like today. And I want to unpack that a little bit, and then we'll try and wrap it up and, again, give some thoughts for the audience and policymakers and leaders of where do we go from here? What do we do next? Again, this is Defending Ideas. We're talking with Beth Akers. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to jump back into our conversation with Beth Akers about the well-being of men and boys and some new survey data from us here at Sutherland Institute in partnership with Y2 Analytics. I want to remind you, if you like this discussion, if you haven't already, please subscribe to Defending Ideas. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, anywhere you like to listen to your shows. You can also get us on YouTube. Just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe wherever you get your shows. You can also find access to all of this and more at defendingideas.org. So, Beth, to kind of round out the conversation, I'm struck by sort of a pattern I think we've organically experienced when we've had some of these prior discussions on this show, where we sort of start from a place of data and evidence and analysis, sort of the policy scholar world.
Yeah.
And they've kind of organically turned into conversations about purpose and meaning and connection.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems relevant for this. So I just want to sort of see what has stood out to you from these conversations that maybe help explain why the survey data tells us what it does.
Gosh, this is so lousy to me as someone who really loves really clear explanations and data. And I would have loved for us to be on this journey of exploring the issue and say like, oh, look, it's because of the decline in manufacturing and that has caused employment rates among men. And that's, they've lost their place because of this. But, the reality is the data does not tell that story. I mean, I think what we're experiencing with men and the outcomes that we've observed that seem problematic are reflecting these sort of slower shifts that are the product of a lot of different innovations, technology, women's evolution in the workforce, like all of these forces that, kind of add up to this slow cultural change that puts us in this sort of squishy place that as an economist, I hate being, but I really do think that this is where we're going to find the answers. And I think the survey data are really consistent with that.
Yeah, one of the most striking things to me was because so much of this, I think it does come back to the purpose question. And, the data about, there's some physical health data there as well. We didn't go through that today just because the mental health data, I think, was higher on my mind as far as helping to tell this story.
Yeah.
But there's some vocational data about employment rates and satisfaction with work.
Mm-hmm.
But then this purpose category, really, I think, seems to say what you're saying is that the story is for the men who struggle, feeling disconnected from society, from civic institutions, from family, from faith, from work, and kind of feeling adrift. They don't have those anchors in their lives. Again, that just is kind of a broad generalizing statement. And I think some of the survey data helps get at that in a really, really profound way. And I want to share a couple other highlights.
Okay.
And then, again, how do we turn this into kind of thoughtful ways to approach this as a state and as a nation?
Right.
So here's another segment from the report. We wrote, to explore the concepts of purpose and place within a community or society, we asked respondents a different question, whether they agreed with the statement, I am struggling to understand my place in my community or in broader society. Utah men were significantly more likely to disagree with this idea, 57%, than men nationwide, 41%. So in other words, Utah men I'm more likely to say I'm not struggling to understand my place in society. I know what I'm supposed to do.
Purpose, identity, that's all strong for men in Utah.
Exactly. Here's the stat. If I had to pick one stat that sort of blew me away when looking at this, it's this one. Alarmingly, 36% of men across the country said they were struggling to understand their place in their community or wider society, compared to 24% of Utah men.
Yeah.
So again, we're better in Utah, but it's still a quarter, and it's over a third of men nationally saying, I don't know what my place is in society.
Right. I mean, I absolutely believe it. And I think this is a critical outcome of women having a better place in the workforce, and that changing the roles of both men and women in the family, as well as, how that extends to community. So again, wonderful that these changes have happened socially for women. And now let's turn our attention to where this has left men. And, again, woe is me, poor men. We don't need them in the same way that we once did. But there are some real challenges that are happening here. And, this is not a sob story about men. This is data is telling us that men are struggling in these ways. And let's make some fixes.
Another aspect of the survey data that really stood out to me, because I think this question of what is my place in society, what am I supposed to do, what kind of man am I supposed to be,
Yeah.
I think also ties into this notion of masculinity.
Yes.
Richard Reeves talks about a lot. I've really appreciated when he sort of pushed back on the narrative around toxic masculinity, saying that we've kind of gone overboard as a society with that. We need sort of a revival of healthy masculinity. Like, what is true healthy masculinity today?
Right.
And to your point earlier, if we've kind of tossed out the script of what that used to look like, I think these men are asking, well, what does it look like today? What am I supposed to do and be today?
Right. And Nick, one of the stats that I noticed when I looked over the report is that when it comes to asking men whether or not they think society has a healthy idea of what healthy masculinity is, Utah men are less likely to say that, in fact, society has, a healthy idea or has an idea of what is healthy masculinity. And this, I think, is striking because to me, this raises a tension that often comes up, I think, implicitly in these conversations about, okay, let's force men or people into communities, give them roles, give them jobs, give them a sense of purpose. And the pushback on that is that those roles can sometimes be constraining in ways that I think are not always healthy. And I wonder if that data point is actually reflecting that yes, men in Utah have a sense of purpose. They have a sense of where they belong in this social structure that is largely influenced by the LDS church. Is that also creating a tension about, with broader society of what is healthy masculinity?
I think it's a really vital question. So here are those percentages you mentioned, because I agree. I think they're not shocking. That sounds too dramatic, but it's really interesting to see this difference. So only 26% of Utah men believe there's a clear definition of what healthy masculinity looks like in society today, compared to 54% of men nationwide. So in other words, over half of men nationally say, yes, there's a clear definition of what healthy masculinity looks like today.
Right.
It's about a quarter of Utah men.
Yeah.
So really stark difference.
Very stark difference
between the two. We asked the question a couple different ways, and the percentages are somewhat comparable.
Right.
But it's the same basic story that nationally, most men say, yeah, there's a definition of healthy masculinity today, or there's an expectation of what that looks like. Most Utah men don't think there is.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think I joked with you before when we were not recording yet, that any researcher always says, well, we need to research more. That's kind of the sometimes annoying to hear researchers say that when they're talking about survey data.
Right. This
is one where I think if we could go back in and ask the question again, or maybe we'll do some focus group conversations in the future to sort of get to that question of, it's one thing to ask, well, does society have a clear definition of healthy masculinity? And then do you feel like you have an internal sense of maybe in your own family, in your own community, in your own state, is there a clear definition of what that looks like? And so that could also be that, is it that men in Utah are saying, yep, we got to figure it out here in Utah. We're working, we're going to church, we're taking care of our families.
Right.
The rest of society has no idea what it means.
Right.
That's where I just don't know yet. We might have to dig a little deeper.
I think this is so critically important because as we think about solutions and this idea that men having a script is helpful, we say to a young man, you need a wife, you need a child, you need a church. And what if for someone, they don't want a wife and they don't want a child? And, to the extent that to some extent these scripts are good and valuable and shaping men's lives gives them a sense of purpose, which we think is a good thing. And then at some level, they can become constraining in a way that conflicts with someone's natural identity. And so how do we grapple with those things as we think about solutions to this problem? I mean, I don't think you need to have the answer today, but I think that's where we have to go here.
Well, you're making me think, because as you say that, I think if you were just to ask me, okay, Nick, like, what's the solution for men and for society generally, everyone, what are the things that people can do to be able to say, I'm thriving, I'm flourishing, I'm leading a great life?
Yeah.
I would say like the base foundational ingredients, I would just say, if I were talking to a young man, I would say, obviously get an education, but I would say, get a job, get married, have a family, go to church, and invest in those civic institutions around you. And most likely, you will do much better than you would if you didn't have those sort of civic anchors in life. So I would still make a strong argument in favor of those things.
Yeah.
But to your point, if someone says, well, I don't want those things,
right,
then the question is, okay, what what does it mean to be a man?
Right.
For someone who maybe, for whatever reason, is not connected to those things. Again, I would argue for recommit to those anchors, those civic institutions.
Mm-hmm.
But I heard this definition, and I can't remember exactly where I heard it in a different podcast discussion of this issue. It might have actually been Richard Reeves when he was talking about this issue in the context of what the state of California did, where Governor Newsom put out an executive order talking about how to engage men in positive ways. So there's a good national momentum on this issue, at least being talked about. But so if it was Richard, good job. If it was someone else, I'm sorry.
Good on them.
Exactly. But it was this question of over and over again, well, we've thrown out the script for men. And men are asking, well, what do I do? And so this question of, well, what is the script now? What is masculinity? The definition that I heard that actually resonated with me a lot is that to be a healthy masculine man today, it means that you now have responsibility that is outward focused in some way.
Yeah.
That a degree of selflessness, a degree of other focus, that if what I do is not just for me, but it's for other people, that's a core component of, you could argue, just adulthood, but I think masculinity, absolutely, that family and faith and work sort of forces that on you.
Right.
But maybe that's the basic principle, that if I'm living for others, am I a healthy masculine man?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think there's also a component of the connectedness, which is that those institutions that you cite, church, family, marriage, I mean, those are institutions that create connectedness for people. And while someone might say, I don't want to be a part of a church, I don't want to be married to a woman or whatever it is, I mean, we can, maybe dig deeper and say, what is it about these institutions that's creating goodness or, well-being for men? Because I think that can, give us a path forward that's like a bit more agnostic about exactly what institutions men subscribe to in order to be thriving.
So I'm going to plug Bill Duncan on our team here at Sutherland, our constitutional law and religious freedom fellow. He's done a ton of work on sort of the role of faith in modern society, and he's addressed some of those kinds of questions before, starting to dig into, well, what is it about faith communities and faith institutions that create some of these positive effects.
Yeah.
And maybe somewhere in there's some ways to replicate that across a wide range of civic institutions. So I'll plug Bill Duncan on here. Folks, go read his stuff. It's great.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt, of course, that churches both create community and the faith itself, creates a sense of well-being for a lot of people. But that may not be something that is reachable by some men. And so I think it's important to broaden the conversation about what is it about these institutions that is replicable in other places, maybe outside of marriage, outside of church, that can be good for men.
That's actually a good point. I wonder if, and this actually ties into the last question I was going to ask you, Beth, as we kind of wrap up, is, well, how do we turn all this into something that's actionable for all of us and for policymakers?
Yeah.
And I think on the societal side, maybe part of the response is, yes, encourage men and people at large to reinvest or recommit to the civic institutions that we know in the evidence are really productive or are protective factors, these positive anchors, while also saying, well, how can we replicate those positive effects across any and every civic institution that exists now or that could exist in the future, to, again, have sort of the most widespread positive benefit of the connectedness you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a problem that, like we've alluded to before, is so hard to pin down solutions for, but I think it's because it needs to be more of an organic solution. And in part, I think that means investing in community organizations so that this work of connectedness can happen, organically and create this web of support for everyone, not just men throughout society. But to me, that seems like the answer when it comes to connectedness. And then also this idea of a script. I mean, I just feel like this is really going to be on civic, institutional, political leaders to change the way that they talk about masculinity. The analysis of the recent election in which President Trump, won the presidency, I think revealed that men are looking for leadership, and very often they're finding leadership in some of these media voices on YouTube or through podcasts. And so we need to create these personalities, this sense of leadership about what masculinity is, in ways that promotes the things that we think are healthy and lead to thriving. And that is this connectedness, the vulnerability, the willingness to seek support. And so, it's hard for me. It's not a subsidy. It's not a tax credit. But I really do think that those are the solutions.
I was going to kind of ask you, and maybe you already did, but if there's one big thing that you take away from the survey data and, the past year's worth of conversations on this issue, you would say this is like maybe not the only, but one of, if not the most important this is just the big idea from this, that leaders in Utah, the national level, and other states, here's the thing you need to keep in mind, or here's what you need to do. Does anything come to mind?
I mean, the headline for me is connectedness. And I think this is for humans broadly. And I think it's especially a challenge for men. And that's kind of what's bubbling up here. I think that institutions that support connectedness, churches are a great example of that, but other institutions can serve that role for people who are not interested in being a part of a church. And I think that we need leadership to invest and express support for institutions, participation in institutions, and I really think that can take us a long way.
I will underscore that and add to it. I love that. I love that idea of connectedness as being so essential, that I think if we can sort of strengthen connectedness somehow, especially for these men who report struggling in these domains, I think that will have a positive effect on mental health, because the lack of social supports of who can I talk to, if you are truly connected in an intimate, tight-knit civic institution or institutions in some form, I think that'll help address that, because now you have more people around you. Obviously, there's still some internal stigma we have to address, but I think that connectedness helps with the mental health side. I also think it helps with the masculinity side, because again, back to that definition that I heard that was impactful to me, that for any men out there saying, well, what kind of man am I supposed to be? It's about living for other people. And connectedness, again, sort of whatever institution you're in, helps you think about others around you. And so I really like that takeaway. So I'll just
and it kind of brings me back. I lived most of my early adulthood on the East Coast in Washington, D.C. And one of the observations I found myself and friends often making is that, it's hard to make friends as an adult. And, it's interesting reflecting on it in the face of this conversation, because what we were, implicitly saying was, when we were in school, it was easy to have friends, right? We were part of an institution that expected us to show up and have relationship to other people. Then we went to college, and that was an institution that created a relationship for us. And so many people in that city were not part of religious organizations, and it was hard to make friends. And so then those friends started having children later in life, and they made friends again because they were part of institutions, and it happened to be their children's community of school and activities. And so I think we have to concede a little bit as humans, like, yes, in theory, we can build community wherever we go on our own, and it can be this individualized, thing that we create ourselves. But the reality is that institutions actually go a really long way in creating connectedness for people. And I think men especially need that right now.
Basic human nature, we need tribes. We need
absolutely.
the right kind of tribalism that's healthy, but we need each other. We need tribes.
Absolutely.
Beth, this has been great. We obviously can keep on going on this. We'll continue these conversations. This work is really important. I am just so grateful to you for all the conversations we've had on this issue, bringing your expertise and insights and kind of helping us make sense of this new survey data as well. So thanks so much for being with us on this episode of Defending Ideas.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're going to take one final break before we leave you all with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas, and special thanks again to Beth Akers for joining us. There's one big theme that stands out to me from this conversation. The anchors that help men thrive are actually the same anchors that strengthen communities. Things like work, family, faith, and connection. For most men, these institutions are protective. They're doing their role. But for a sizable minority, a fifth to a third of men nationwide, those anchors are missing. And the struggles go unseen that these men face. As you and I engage in conversations about solutions to these issues, it's worth remembering that this isn't just a policy challenge, but a purpose and societal challenge. So every time we talk about men's well-being, whether it's about mental health, economic prospects, or healthy masculinity, we can point people back to the stabilizing forces that help give life meaning and purpose. And also, I can't help but come back to this question about masculinity. So often in these conversations, we hear that the script has been thrown out, so to speak, and men don't know what they're supposed to do now or what kind of man they're supposed to be. To begin to answer that question, I want to echo this basic principle as part of the definition of healthy masculinity today, that part of being a man is living for other people, adopting a degree of selflessness that compels you to be willing to forego some things in order to serve a greater purpose that blesses the lives of others. Now, I know we're going to continue to debate what 21st century masculinity means as a society, but I think starting from the recognition that at least part of it involves embracing responsibilities that focus on others will really help the conversation. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Make sure to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it valuable. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.